I can start at the beginning with the concept that you helped coin and label novel ecosystems. What led you to that discovery?
I came a little late to it, actually. The idea had been floating around since the late 1990s. And throughout the 2000s, people were beginning to question whether some types of ecosystems had changed so much as a consequence of climate and invasive species that they were becoming practically unrestorable. And so I got involved in 2009 when Richard Hobbs and Jim Harris and I published a paper that picked up from some of the earlier work and created this concept for novel ecosystems. I didn't coin the term, we didn't coin the term exactly, but we felt that it was sent out a strong signal to the community, the larger ecological community, that something different was happening.
What would you put at the center, at the core of that concept?
Well, three things. The first is that ecosystems are changing in their composition and function. So different types of species than we've seen there historically before. And the second is that they have, as a consequence of that, novel ecosystems have passed a threshold beyond which those very changed ecosystems can't be taken back. They can't be restored in any easy or practical way. There's a lot of debate about what that means, but that's the practical idea. And then the third is that those novel ecosystems stand alone and do their own thing. They are functioning ecosystems. So they're very different than, say, heavily managed parks or gardens or agricultural systems. Those aren't novel ecosystems. Might be designed ecosystems, but novel ecosystems are those ecosystems that are largely functioning without a lot of human intervention or no human intervention, but are doing so in a way that there's no historical analog. We can't look back in history, at least in the last few hundred years, and see something that looks like a novel ecosystem.
There are also a number of critics on that approach. What do you say in regards of the usual arguments that are brought forth, saying that it's not the norm?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of different types of concerns about novel ecosystems, some of which we identified and thought about in the book that came out in 2013 that sort of scanned a lot of the issues with novel ecosystems. But there's some misunderstandings, I think, around the relationship between what we called hybrid ecosystems and novel ecosystems. So where this interview is taking place could be classified as a hybrid ecosystem. I mean, I'm looking around and I'm seeing a mix of invasive exotic plants like English holly and English ivy and so on. But I'm also seeing a forest stand structure that is dominated by fairly uneven sized and aged Douglas fir trees, which are the dominant tree of this region. So this is a hybrid system where it's historically continuous. We can trace a lineage, but it has novel elements. Can it be restored? Sure. Will it take a lot of effort? Absolutely. And so there's a lot of debate about where, I think a lot of the truly challenging issues lie in that hybrid zone, right, where they're neither novel nor historical in any clear sense, or historically continuous. So that's where a lot of the complex issues for restoration lie. I think there's been some misunderstanding of that. I think there's been legitimate concern around the use of the term novel. Some people have been put off by the association with a kind of consumer culture of novelty. Hey, we've got these great new ecosystems, and people are going to be thinking that that's a good thing. But I think embedded in that critical assessment is perhaps also some confusion about where we're going to go in the future as novelty increases. Novelty is not decreasing, it's increasing. And so how do we assign value to those highly changed systems? when they actually are doing their own thing pretty well, and they're engaging, they're supporting functions that ecosystems, would expect, that we would expect ecosystems to have in that place. It's tough. It's really challenging.
Does maybe the approach also help to better comprehend more of these postmodern notions in regards to how is naturalness being defined? Can we gain another perspective on these things?
Well, I think if anything, novel ecosystems fits well with the complications that postmodern thinking about nature has generated. I mean, we now no longer, mostly we don't use the term nature in any simple way anymore. It's just a really complicated term. And that also includes ideas like wildness and wilderness, and the idea of an original ecosystem, or an ecosystem that exists prior to human use, which is now we know not to be very true. So, it's very complicated. I think novel ecosystems is just, it allows people to intervene responsibly in ecosystems that have been transformed. And I think what we were seeing, and the evidence from case studies around the world, is that there was a lot of frustration when you have an ecosystem that has, say, persistent invasive species. You're not going to get rid of them very easily, like Scotch broom or, English ivy in these ecosystems where we're sitting. So what do you do with that? How do you manage it going forward? And is it a realistic goal to think that you can restore it, and as the Society for Ecological Restoration is now advocating this 5-star approach where, presumably the highest and best form of restoration is a pretty austere notion of what restoration will accomplish. I think novel ecosystem challenges some of that and says, well, there are functioning ecosystems that we need to come to terms with. Do we embrace them fully and say this is what we ought to aim for? No, not necessarily. Do we say that they are bad systems or systems that we shouldn't value? No. I mean, it's more complicated, so it's really challenging our conventions around how we think of ecological restoration.
Maybe one of your colleagues in the field of restoration ecology, Robert Elliott, he opened up that debate 25 years ago when he was thinking about, and he used the term wilderness. What is wilderness? How can we define it? And I think he came up with the idea that it has a special continuity and a special relationship with the past, which has not been interrupted. How do you see it in regards to the future? Is there also a special continuity when it comes to ecosystem restoration?
Yeah, well, ecological restoration, ecosystem restoration. By the way, I use the term ecological to refer to a much broader set of practices that define restoration. I see ecosystem restoration, and this is a bit at odds perhaps with some international usage, but ecosystem restoration pertains to the specific spatial unit we're interested in, like an ecosystem. You can also have community restoration, species restoration, landscape restoration, so it's a scale issue for me. So I use the term ecological restoration to envelop all of that, because the approach is fundamentally an ecological one. With restoration, there is an embedded historical value that to think that you are engaging in restoration is to reflect on a time when a particular ecosystem was different, and we assign value to that as being better, or at least better in the sense of having things like ecological integrity or capacity for resilience, or any number of other factors that we can take into account. So historical notions are embedded right within restoration, and so that's what connects us historically, even in transformed systems. So if you look at the concept of novel ecosystems as it's been developed, it really relies very heavily on historical continuity. You can see it. And with novel ecosystems, you can actually track the changes in a system, even if they've been very, very significant. So I think to abandon historical notions is a mistake, and one that shouldn't be countenanced.
very interesting. Another term which you used a lot in your research and science is focal restoration. What does that encapsulate? What is that notion about?
Well, focal restoration acknowledges that a lot of restoration engages people, and it engages people in many, many different ways, whether it has to do with livelihood or enjoyment or spiritual relationships, all the different ways that we participate. And a lot of restoration activities have taken place at a community level, where volunteers, sometimes with professional support, will go in and they'll conduct the restoration activity. What's interesting is the social benefits that go with that. That people connect as a human community in relation to that ecosystem. So focal restoration takes that a little further and says, when we're restoring, when we're engaged in an act of restoration, it focuses our attention on things that matter deeply to us. The idea comes from Albert Borgman, the American philosopher, who writes a lot about how we find things to value in a highly technological society. So restoration is one of those. By engaging in a bodily and social practice, we're committing to that act, and we're saying this is something that we value, and it focuses our attention on it, and also focuses our life to an extent. You know, we identify with doing restoration. Restoration, you know, involves skills. We have to develop those skills and so on. So that's what I mean by focal restoration.
Some are talking about the age of restoration. Do you align with these people? Had we entered such an age, especially in the context of the Anthropocene?
Well, I'm wary of that, but it makes a lot of sense, at least at one level. It says to us that we have entered an era where we have recognized that we can restore ecosystems that we have damaged. And so there's widespread recognition, including the recent UN declaration for the Decade of Restoration coming up. So that's powerful, and I think that's the right way to think about it. Where I worry a little bit is in some ideas connected to Anthropocene thinking. There's this notion that perhaps we can make lots of changes and interventions in ecosystems and then come back and restore them. That's the wrong way to think about how the age of restoration. Years ago, I had a conversation with the literary historian Leo Marx, who wrote this wonderful book I think in the 1960s called The Machine in the Garden, in which he spoke about an American pastoral idea. And he invoked this, what he called a cultural mode. And I thought, that's interesting. I wonder if restoration is a kind of cultural mode, if we could develop a social appreciation for restoration that becomes deeply embedded in how we do our activities and relate and practice restoration.
How would you define good ecological restoration?
Well, I'll turn to some of the thinking that I've been doing recently around what is a good ecological restoration. I think it's involved. I think I go back to some of my work and the work of others in defining what I think of as Keystone Concepts. You know, the notion of a keystone where you've got an arch that's held up by individual stones. You pull one out and the whole arch collapses. And so I've been trying to think, well, what are the essential stones that you need to hold up the arch of restoration? And I think they are these. There's 4 of them. The first is around ecological integrity. So what makes an ecosystem cohere, makes it whole? It's a metaphorical notion, but we can also develop ways of measuring and putting that into practice. The second is a bit of an awkward term, historicity, the quality of historical knowledge, right? Or the quality of something being historical. So it doesn't mean that restoration is like an older notion from 20 or 30 years ago where the goal of restoration was to take an ecosystem back to exactly the way it was before it was degraded. But historicity engages us in reflecting on how ecosystems change and how we set goals based on what we know about the past. The third is what we just spoke about a few minutes ago. The third is concerns focal practices, or what I now call focal nature. So how is it that the other than human world focuses our attention on things that matter and realigns our understanding and participation in those ecosystems? And finally, the idea of wild design. Wild design is, metaphorically speaking, a conversation that we have with ecosystems, with the other than human world. So we recognize with wild design that we're not there as people to change and to modify and to determine what that ecosystem is going to be like just for human interests. But we're always aware that the ecosystem has its own properties, its own functions, and that we're there to nurture those, to help them along, or as the formal definition of restoration says, to assist the recovery of an ecosystem. Well, I'm an advocate of projects that create a long-term understanding of the continuity of landscapes and ecosystems. And that's one of the reasons why I've been drawn to and continue to be involved with the Mountain Legacy Project, is to animate this remarkable historical collection of photographs, the largest of its kind in the world, to understand how the mountain landscapes in Canada are changing over time. And it seems to me just this valuable trove of information that we can work with. And we don't pay enough attention to the long term, to understanding historical change and having science that supports that kind of long-term continuity. How do you develop a culture of science that encourages people to ask long-running questions and be able to do them in place over time? So we have fewer of those examples than we should.
What kind of questions will help the axioms of ecosystem restoration evolve further? What kind of new questions do we need?
There are several new questions that we can ask of ecological restoration that will help to guide it into the future. One of them, I think, is concentrating more on process and function. So that's in a technical sense around the ecosystems themselves. How do we understand the traits that individuals and communities and ecosystems represent? And then using that trait-based approach, how do we restore to reflect and carry those traits forward in ecosystems? This is becoming necessary in hybrid and novel ecosystems where you have different species that are standing in for native species, for example, or whether you have climate change systems in which you have really jumbled up ecosystems that are responding to alterations in temperature or precipitation. And so you have to think about, well, how do we restore to reflect the functions going forward? So that's one big question. Another question is, how do we create an overarching view of restoration that embeds all of the different practices that relate to it? So I include ecosystem restoration, rewilding, forest landscape restoration, food forestry and ecological agriculture, and even designed ecosystems and the process of regenerative design. So how do we incorporate those? How do we come up with a way of thinking about restoration that both animates all those different practices, positions them where they can be used best, and provides a kind of ethical code around their proper use? I think that's a huge question. That's a lot of questions, but that's the overarching one. A third question would be around how we can transform the way that we engage on a daily basis with the other than human world. How we can develop a greater appreciation and connection for people with all types of ecosystems, including in urban and urbanizing areas where ecosystems then pushed aside. How can we redesign our cities that reflect a restorative or regenerative way of being? How can we change that? So the children will experience nearby nature and have it be meaningful for them, where they can not just have the degraded bits of ecosystems, but they can actually respond to understanding what how that ecosystem changes over time and what they can do to assist recovery. So that's how I think there's a lot there that needs to be answered, has been answered. That's good.
You already answered a lot from the next question. What would be your wish for ecological restoration on a planetary scale? What needs to happen?
At a planetary scale, it's very difficult for us to think responsibly about how we act. And so my wish for ecological restoration, that it holds on to its community-based origins, that it continues to draw nourishment from the many, many participatory community, volunteer-driven projects that have made restoration work and provide sustainable ways of life for people. What I fear is that in scaling up restoration to deal with admittedly urgent questions of climate, and desertification, and food security, and poverty, that we're going to do things that actually are short-sighted at a large scale. So we're going to engage in a lot of plantation forestry and call it restoration, or something like that. And we're going to start doing restoration from the top down rather than being responsive to the very people who can actually work and understand and nourish that system over many decades and centuries. That's what we need. We need to hold on to that, seeing that there are 1 million restoration projects around the world, and that we draw nourishment, strength from that as we evolve a planetary vision for it.